All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling, well, a pretty huge figure, Friedrich Schlegel.
Yeah, Schlegel, really one of those figures who just keeps on giving, right? I mean, it's so much to unpack there.
I mean, people probably know him best for like literary criticism, but um but I think we're going to be looking more at the philosophy, like
Yeah.
how those two things work
Yeah, I'd
together.
really separate them, right? Especially with the romantics. Everything kind of bleeds into everything else. It's all connected.
Right, right, exactly. It all comes together in this kind of crazy, beautiful way.
Exactly.
So we're going to be looking at Schlegel, particularly how his philosophy develops and really kind of how it intertwines with his thinking about literature. And we should probably also just mention, right off the bat, that he doesn't come out of nowhere. Like he comes from this family, a really interesting family.
A very literary family, yeah. I mean, you've got his father, a clergyman, but also involved in literary circles. And then there's his uncle, a dramatist, an aesthetic theorist. And then, of course, well, we can't forget the brother, right?
Without Wilhelm, yeah.
The translator of Shakespeare, and I mean himself, a major figure in literary criticism.
Really an impressive intellectual lineage.
It's quite a legacy to live up to, you know?
And it seems like he did in a lot of ways, but he doesn't start out like fully formed as this romantic figure. He actually begins studying law, right, at Göttingen in Leipzig. But by 1793, he's kind of like moving away from that and really diving into classical literature. And he starts this life as a freelance writer.
Right, and that's really when we see this kind of early classicist phase of his thought emerging. And, a good example of that is his essay on the study of Greek poetry. He finishes that around 1795. And in that essay, he draws this really sharp, almost like black and white distinction between ancient literature, which he sees as the striving for beauty, for objectivity, for, reaching that kind of timeless ideal, and then, modern literature, which he sees as something different. He calls it interesting, characteristic, individual. It's all about originality, the kind of spark of the new.
So it's almost like there's a shift, right, from striving for perfection to kind of embracing this uniqueness, this individuality.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting, for a philosopher, think about how this kind of echoes Schiller's his distinction between naive and sentimental poetry. But, Schlegel arrives at this through his own
Really?
path, his own thinking.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And then, speaking of interesting, you have this figure of Caroline Boomer, who he meets in 1794.
Mhm.
And, she's quite a figure in her own right.
Mm.
Later becomes his brother's wife.
And then Schelling's wife.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
But she has this really kind of fascinating life. I mean, daughter of a prominent professor, and then there's, wartime occupation, pregnancy, even imprisonment. And it seems like through meeting her and talking with her, Schlegel really starts to think more about political and social issues. Like her experiences really have this impact on him.
It's fascinating to see how those kinds of lived experiences really shape, these intellectual journeys. It's not all like abstract theorizing in a vacuum.
Right,
It's
exactly.
it's rooted in these real, sometimes messy, complicated life events.
Absolutely. And then, 1796, he moves to Jena, which at that time is like this hotbed of intellectual activity. And that's largely because Fichte has arrived there. And that's where he starts to really immerse himself in this romantic movement, connecting with all these key figures. I mean, think about Schleiermacher. He actually becomes his roommate. Yeah. They even start working on a Plato translation project, though Schleiermacher ends up carrying that on largely on his own.
Yeah.
But, he needs Take, Wackenroder, and then, of course, there's Novalis, who's really crucial in introducing him to Fichtean idealism.
Yeah. Jena at this time was just this incredible place for intellectual ferment, right? You had all these bright minds bumping into each other, arguing, collaborating, constantly challenging and refining each other's ideas.
Exactly. And it's out of that energy that the Athenaeum Journal emerges.
1798 to 1800.
Right. And it's this collaborative project with his brother, Novalis, and Schleiermacher. And this is where they publish, their famous fragments.
Those little bursts of thought.
Yeah. Almost like intellectual sparks, deliberately unfinished, right?
Yeah.
Meant to provoke thought rather than present this kind of neat, systematic philosophy.
Exactly. So typical of early romanticism, right? These tantalizing glimpses into their thought processes, not giving you the whole picture, but inviting you into the process, showing you how it's always evolving, always open-ended.
Yeah. And then, speaking of connections, while he's in Berlin, he starts a relationship with Dorothea Wied, who's the daughter of Moses Mendelssohn. And this was quite scandalous at the time. She leaves her husband, who's a banker, in 1798. And then their relationship really becomes, kind of a public thing with the publication of his novel, Lucinde, in 1799.
Which, for the time was seen as quite risque, maybe not so much by today's standards, but the way it depicted their relationship very openly and frankly, that was pretty provocative.
Right. And then, around 1799, he goes back to Jena. And from 1800 to 1801, he's actually giving lectures on transcendental philosophy at the University of Jena. And there's this really, potentially interesting little tidbit here. Hegel had just arrived in Jena himself, and there's a good chance he was in the audience for some of these lectures. So you have these two figures who would later become these huge, sometimes rivals in the world of German philosophy.
Yeah. The Schlegel-Hegel relationship is definitely a complicated one. I mean, there's debate about how much they actually influenced each other, but, it's fascinating to think that they were in the same room, maybe even exchanging ideas at this early stage.
Yeah, definitely. And then, so Jena kind of breaks up in December 1801, that Jena circle kind of disperses a little bit. And Schlegel spends time in Berlin, Dresden, and then eventually moves to Paris in 1802. And there, he starts another journal, Europa. And we see this shift in his focus. He becomes really interested in the figurative arts.
Yeah, he starts writing about paintings in the Louvre. He's even giving lectures on art history for the Boissier brothers, who are these big-time art collectors.
Really showing the breadth of his interests. And then in 1804, he moves again, this time to Cologne. And here it gets even more interesting. He starts studying German Gothic architecture. And he's also still working on philosophy, giving these lectures on the history of philosophy titled Die Entwicklung der Philosophie. And then he kind of embarks on this new, huge intellectual adventure, studying Sanskrit, Hindu religious writings.
And this really, it expands his intellectual horizons in a major way, right? It's not just Western thought anymore. He's engaging with these really rich and complex traditions from the East, which, it makes sense in a way, right? Romanticism had this fascination with the exotic, with the search for these deeper, more universal forms of understanding.
Right, right. And it's not just like a passing interest either. I mean, it really culminates in this major work on the language and wisdom of the Indians, which comes out in 1808. And this book is absolutely crucial in the development of comparative grammar. I mean, he actually coins the term comparative grammar in this book.
Which is such a revolutionary idea, right? Like looking at how different languages are related, tracing their family trees, so to speak. It's really looking at language in this whole new way.
Right. And this engagement with Hindu thought also really has a profound impact on his own religious beliefs. In 1808, he and Dorothea convert to Catholicism, and this kind of coincides with a bit of a shift in his political views as well.
Yeah, that's always a fascinating dynamic to consider, right? The relationship between religious and political transformations. I mean, it happens so often in intellectual history, but it's always so complex and kind of unique to the individual.
Right, absolutely. And then, so the final chapter, I guess, is Vienna. He enters the Austrian civil service in 1809 and lives there for the rest of his life. And he does all sorts of things there, like edits an anti-Napoleonic newspaper, starts more journals at the Deutsches Museum. Concordia becomes this popular public lecturer, even advises Metternich on, the possibility of a German constitution in 1813.
Quite a varied career.
Yeah, very busy, very impactful. So, we've kind of traced this really rich and kind of winding intellectual journey. But let's maybe take a step back and think about some of the key transformations, right? Like he starts with this pretty defined classicist view, really valuing that beautiful and objective quality in ancient Greek poetry. But then he undergoes this romantic turn, right? And he begins to really emphasize the interesting and the characteristic nature of modern literature. And this eventually leads him to this idea of the Romantic as this progressive universal poetry, something that tries to fuse poetry and prose, inspiration and criticism.
Right. He wants to break down these traditional boundaries. And this shift from that earlier kind of binary between ancient and modern aesthetics to this much more fluid, encompassing view of the Romantic. It's really key to understanding Schlegel's influence, his lasting impact.
And central to this whole vision of modern literature is the Roman, the novel. He doesn't just see it as another genre. He sees it as this modern epic, something that surpasses traditional forms in its ability to grapple with the complexities of modern life,
Absolutely. And even his aesthetic criteria start to reflect this emphasis on the individual, the dynamic. He's arguing that, we should move away from judging works based on some pre-established ideal, some universal standard, and instead criticism should be about understanding and articulating the unique individual ideal of each specific work. You can see the influence of Herder there, with his focus on the historical political and cultural situatedness of individuals and cultures. And Kant, of course, especially his critique of judging beauty based on these rigid rules.
So really moving away from these universalizing principles and towards this more like contextualized and individual approach to judgment.
Yeah. It's a crucial development in aesthetic theory, and we can see Schlegel really putting this into practice in his early critical essays, the ones on Jacobi, Forster, Lessing, and then there's his famous review of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, where he says that the novel not only judges itself, but also describes itself. It's like the work contains its own internal standards, its own criteria for evaluation.
That's a great point. And then, stylistically, he and the other romantics are really drawn to forms and concepts that reflect this kind of dynamic and open-ended worldview. Like, think about the fragment. It's incomplete, right? But it still has this kind of unity, this wholeness. Like, it's a little piece of a larger, maybe ultimately ungraspable whole.
It's like this little window into this chaotic universality.
Right. And then there's irony, which, Schlegel writes so much about irony, and he sees it as this kind of simultaneous self-creation, self-limitation, even self-destruction.
Yeah.
He even says that philosophy is the true home of irony, and he defines irony as logical beauty.
It's not just sarcasm or playful inversion, right? It's this really deep philosophical stance. It's about recognizing the limits of any single perspective, but also being open to the infinite possibilities of other perspectives.
Right. It's about this constant critical self-awareness, this awareness that all knowledge and artistic creation are in some way provisional. And his examples, like the Parabasis in ancient comic drama or the Italian buffo, they really highlight this idea of breaking the fourth wall, of acknowledging the artificiality of art.
Yeah, he's playing with these layers of meaning, of reality and representation.
Right, right. And then his theory of literary genres also undergoes this really interesting evolution. Like, he moves away from those kind of rigid Enlightenment classifications, and he ends up seeing the novel as this kind of transcending form, like it exists almost beyond genre. He even says that you could argue for infinitely many genres, or maybe at the highest level, just a single evolving, progressive, poetical genre.
Which, again, reflects that romantic desire to break down boundaries, to embrace hybridity, to see everything as interconnected and constantly evolving. And the novel, in its ability to kind of incorporate elements of epic, lyric, dramatic forms, it becomes the perfect embodiment of that impulse.
Exactly. And then, I think to bring in our philosopher listener here, we need to talk about his engagement with German idealism.
Yeah.
And he's clearly wrestling with some of the same questions as his contemporaries, how to reconcile that emphasis on subjective freedom that you see in Fichte with the more holistic vision of Spinozistic thought. And he very likely attended Fichte's lectures in Jena, and he was definitely influenced by Novalis' deep engagement with idealist philosophy. And a key part of their early philosophical discussions was this shared critique of this reliance on a single foundational first principle.
Yeah. Like what they saw in Reinhold and Fichte.
Right. And this is a really important point, this romantic contribution to this critique of foundationalism in philosophy in the 1790s. Like, they're really questioning this very idea that there can be this single, unshakable starting point for all philosophical inquiry.
Which, in a way, anticipates some of the anti-foundationalist arguments that we see later in philosophy.
Absolutely. And Schlegel's writings from this period, which is sometimes called his philosophical apprenticeship, around 1796, along with his notes from his Jena lectures on transcendental philosophy, give us this really fascinating, if sometimes frustratingly incomplete, glimpse into this kind of critical phase of his thought. And his critique of this reliance on a single first principle, it really stems from this deep-seated sense that the absolute, the unconditioned, it's ultimately beyond our grasp.
Like, that famous line from Novalis, everywhere we seek the unconditioned but find only things.
Right. It's this skepticism towards the possibility of absolute knowledge that's grounded in this one ultimate principle. And, Schlegel even argues that even seemingly self-evident propositions, they can be legitimately doubted, which, can lead to this infinite regress of justification.
Right. It's like, where do you stop? How do you ever find that truly solid foundation?
Exactly. And so, in contrast to Fichte's very systematic approach, where you're trying to build this whole system from this single starting point, Schlegel proposes these really interesting ideas of an alternating proof, or Wechselweis, and an alternating concept, or Wechselbegriff. He's saying that the ground of his philosophical system doesn't lie in this singular postulate, this conditional proposition, but rather in this dynamic process of reciprocal proving of conceptual interaction.
Yeah, it's this idea of alternating proof that's really crucial to understanding Schlegel's non-foundationalism. He's not thinking of philosophy as this linear progression building up from a single foundation. It's more like this circular process, this constant process of infinite progression and mutual support among ideas.
And he famously says that philosophy, like a great epic poem, has to begin in the middle.
Right. And not only alternating proof, but also alternating concept.
Right. So every concept, every proof, it can be questioned. It needs further justification. So it's not building from a single foundation. It's more like different parts of the argument supporting each other in this kind of continuous loop.
Exactly. It's holistic. It's historical. It recognizes that philosophical inquiry is always ongoing, always evolving.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, briefly, I think we should touch on his early ethical, social, and political views. It's interesting to note that he really emphasized love as the highest form of aesthetic enjoyment. And he believed that this experience of love, it could only be truly realized between free and equal individuals. And then, in his early reading of Kant's Perpetual Peace, he actually advocates for a more radically democratic form of republicanism than Kant himself. He even goes so far as to suggest that insurrection could be legitimate in certain circumstances.
Which is pretty striking, especially when you consider where he ends up later.
Yeah, I mean, it really shows this commitment to these democratic ideals in his early writing.
Right, and it puts him closer to, thinkers like Fichte, even Herder and Forster, in his advocacy for a much broader understanding of suffrage and popular sovereignty.
Right, exactly. But then, of course, there's this later conservative term, particularly once he's in Vienna. You see this in his work, Signature of the Age, where he's critiquing both idealism and parliamentary government. And he's advocating for this organic Christian state centered around the monarch.
Yeah. And this has led to a lot of, debate among scholars about how consistent his thought really was. Like, how do you reconcile these two seemingly very different Schlegels?
Right. It's like Maurice Blanchard asking, which Schlegel is the real Schlegel?
Exactly. But, I think even in his later lectures, the ones on history, the philosophy of life, the philosophy of language, even though there's this clear shift in tone and focus, there's still a lot of valuable stuff there. Like his emphasis on the dialogical nature of thought, of how we use language to think and communicate, it's really insightful.
Yeah, I agree. It's not like his thinking just becomes stagnant, It's still evolving, even if it's moving in a different direction.
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our philosopher listener with this thought, right? Schlegel places this huge emphasis on the individual ideal of a work.
Oh.
And maybe we can think about that not just for literary texts, but for philosophical arguments or even entire philosophical systems. So, how might that perspective, that way of approaching things, how might that help us understand these really complex philosophical systems that don't fit neatly into easy categories? And maybe even, his concept of irony, this clear consciousness of eternal agility of an instantly teeming chaos. Could that be a useful way to navigate those ambiguities, those uncertainties that we always encounter in philosophical inquiry?
It's definitely something worth pondering. I mean, ultimately, I think Schlegel's legacy is not just about the specific content of his theories, but about his willingness to question, to embrace complexity, to see the world, both the world of art and the world of philosophy, as this dynamic, evolving thing. He gives us a lot to think about, even today.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave it there for this deep dive.
Okay.
Thanks for listening.